We often get caught up in the really flashy software features, the slick UIs. But what about the very first thing people often encounter? That initial impression.
Oh, you mean documentation. Dan Allen calls it the curb appeal for software.
Exactly. And there's this pretty startling statistic from Red Monk analysis. It suggests that good documentation is actually the deciding factor in software adoption almost half the time.
That's huge. And it really contrasts sharply with, well, the reality, doesn't it?
Yeah.
A GitHub survey back in 2017 found like 93% of people had run into documentation that was incomplete or just plain wrong. Outdated.
Wow, 93%. So it seems like everyone knows good docs are vital, but actually doing it well, that's the challenge.
It absolutely is. And it's not just a small frustration for users, it's a massive opportunity. Get documentation right, and you improve the user experience and gain a real competitive edge.
Right. Which brings us to our deep dive today. We're looking at Antora, an open source tool specifically built to tackle these exact documentation headaches.
Yeah, created by Dan Allen over at Open Devise. Antora is really designed to make creating, collaborating on, and scaling docs, especially for software teams, much, much smoother.
So what's the fundamental problem it's trying to crack?
Well, think about modern software. The documentation, it might be scattered across lots of different places, maybe multiple code repositories. You've got versioning complexities, and teams often prefer specific formats, like a KaiDoc, which Dan Allen mentioned was a big driver.
Okay, so the standard static site generators, the general purpose ones, they often struggle with that kind of complexity.
They really do. Allen pointed out that people spend a lot of time trying to bend those tools to fit documentation needs. And, the results aren't always great. It's often a square peg, round hole situation.
So Antora comes in as what? A specialized tool?
Precisely. It's a static site generator, but purpose-built for documentation. It embraces a KDoc right from the start and is designed specifically to handle these unique documentation challenges.
And the philosophy behind it is this docs as code idea, right?
Exactly. It's all about using the same kind of tools and processes for documentation that developers use for code. Think version control, CI/CD pipelines, automated workflows, applying that rigor to docs.
Okay, let's dig into how Antora actually makes that happen. First up, this idea of distributed content. Docs aren't always in one neat little folder.
No, definitely not. They might be right next to the code they describe, or in a totally separate repo, or maybe spread across several. Antora is built to find and pull that content together wherever it lives.
How does it know where to look?
It relies on a standard project structure. Antora looks for a specific folder, usually called docs. And right inside that, at the root, it expects a file named antora.aml.
Antora.aml, what does that do?
Think of it like a little label or manifest for that chunk of documentation. It identifies the component, which is basically the product or library, and the specific version these docs belong to.
Right, so Antora acts kind of like a smart Git client then. It fetches content based on
based on a central configuration file called the playbook. The playbook is where you list all the Git repositories Antora needs to look at, which branches within those repos, and even specific starting paths if needed.
So the playbook is the master inventory.
Exactly. Antora reads the playbook first, figures out where everything is, then goes and clones or fetches it all. It gathers all that content, reads the Antora.iml files for metadata, and builds what it calls the content catalog.
The content catalog, so that's like a unified, organized view of all the docs, regardless of where they originally came from.
Precisely. It's the aggregated source material ready for processing.
Okay, now versioning. Software changes, versions get released, documentation needs to keep pace. How does Antora handle that?
This is really core to Antora's design.
Yeah.
Dan Allen stressed that components, the products, and their versions are first-class citizens. They're not an afterthought. The system understands them fundamentally.
So typically, a component might map to a Git repository and a version to a specific branch. Is that the usual setup?
That's a very common pattern, yeah. But it's flexible. The key thing, again, is that Antora.eml file. It explicitly links the documentation files to a component and version, even if those files live in different repos or branches.
Ah, okay. So you can use Git branches to manage doc versions, just like you do for code releases, like a 1.0 branch, a 2.0 branch, etc.
Exactly. You mirror your software development workflow. And once Antora reads the content and its associated Antora.eml, the original repo and branch details become less important. What matters is the metadata Antora has extracted as content belongs to component X, version Y.
And what does that metadata enable?
Some really powerful stuff. It allows for intelligent cross-referencing. You can easily link between pages, even if they're in different components or different versions of the same component.
Oh, interesting. So you could link from a page in version 2.0 back to the equivalent concept in version 1.0.
Yep. Or link to related features in a completely different product's documentation. And crucially, it enables navigation between different versions of the same page. So if a user is looking at the docs for version 5.5, they can easily jump to the 6.0 version of that page, or vice versa.
That sounds incredibly useful for users who might be stuck on older versions for a while.
Absolutely. It keeps the documentation relevant to their specific context.
Okay, another architectural point that seems quite unique is the separation of the user interface from the content.
Yes, this is a big one. Alan explained that the UI, the look and feel, the theme, the website wrapper, is a completely separate project in Antora.
A separate project. How does that work?
The UI project exports what's called a UI bundle. This bundle contains all the templates, the CSS, the JavaScript, everything needed for the visual presentation. And Antora then takes this bundle and applies it to the content during the build process.
So the actual documentation repositories just contain the SCDoc files and images?
Pretty much. Pure content and maybe supporting assets like images or diagrams. All the web design complexity lives in that separate UI project.
What are the advantages of splitting it up like that?
Several big ones. First, you can apply one single consistent UI across all your documentation components and versions. Instant brand consistency.
Right, makes sense.
Second, it lets your web developers or designers focus entirely on the UI, the theme, interactions, accessibility, without needing to touch the documentation content itself, and vice versa for the writers.
Clean separation of concerns.
Exactly. And the playbook ties it together. You just specify the URL for the UI bundle you want to use in the playbook.
Oh, so you could easily swap themes just by changing that URL, maybe for A/B testing different looks.
Absolutely. Point to a different UI bundle URL, rebuild, and you've got a completely different look and feel applied to the exact same content. It's very flexible.
Okay, so let's talk workflow. How does a team actually use Antora day to day?
Well, the idea is to fit into existing developer workflows. You write the content in a SciDoc, which is just plain text with semantic markup. Any developer or writer can edit it in their favorite IDE or text editor.
So, familiar tools and publishing.
Yeah.
How does the site get built and deployed?
This is where the Docs as code really shines. You typically run Antora as part of a continuous integration or CI pipeline.
Ah, automation. So, what happens step by step?
Sure. So the webhook fires, starting a CI job. The CI server typically installs Antora if it's not already there. Then it clones your playbook repository, the central configuration.
Got it.
Antora runs using that playbook. First, it figures out from the playbook which content repositories and branches it needs. Then, usually in parallel, it clones all those content repos and downloads the UI bundle you specify.
Pulling all the pieces together.
Right. Once it has all the content and the UI, it builds that content catalog we mentioned, organizing and indexing everything. Then it generates the actual static website files, HTML, CSS, JS. And this generation step can even be extended with custom logic if needed.
And the final step.
The final step is outputting the generated site. It might just write it to a folder, create a zip archive, or maybe even push it directly to a staging or production server, ready to be synced to your web host or CDN.
That sounds pretty streamlined.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned Dan Allen gave a demo using Couchbase docs.
Yes, they recently migrated their extensive documentation to Antora, so it's a great real-world example. He started by pointing out that the Antora command line tool and the site generator itself are actually separate packages.
Why is that significant?
It highlights the modularity. You could, in theory, plug in a completely different site generator if you had very specific needs. So the webhook fires, starting a CI job. The CI server typically installs Antora if it's not already there. Then it clones your playbook repository, the central configuration.
Got it.
Antora runs using that playbook. First, it figures out from the playbook which content repositories and branches it needs. Then, usually in parallel, it clones all those content repos and downloads the UI bundle you specify.
Pulling all the pieces together.
Right. Once it has all the content and the UI, it builds that content catalog we mentioned, organizing and indexing everything. Then it generates the actual static website files, HTML, CSS, JS, and this generation step can even be extended with custom logic if needed.
And the final step.
The final step is outputting the generated site. It might just write it to a folder, create a zip archive, or maybe even push it directly to a staging or production server, ready to be synced to your web host or CDN.
That sounds pretty streamlined.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned Dan Allen gave a demo using Couchbase docs.
Yes, they recently migrated their extensive documentation to Antora, so it's a great real-world example. He started by pointing out that the Antora command line tool and the site generator itself are actually separate packages.
Why is that significant?
It highlights the modularity. You could, in theory, plug in a completely different site generator if you had very specific needs, though most users stick with the default.
Okay, and the playbook? Did he show what that looked like?
Yeah, he showed a basic YAML playbook. It had the URLs for their content repositories on GitHub, listed the branches they wanted to pull docs from, like master and release branches 6.0,
Yeah.
5.5, and the URL pointing to their custom UI bundle. Pretty straightforward.
And running it.
Simple Antora command pointing to that playbook file. It then kicked off the process, cloning the repos, downloading the UI, building everything.
Right.
And boom, a public folder appeared containing the entire Couchbase documentation site, fully functional and viewable, completely offline. He even compared it side by side with their livedocs.couchbase.com site.
Nice. How did he demonstrate the versioning aspect?
That was really clear. He simply added another branch, I think it was release 5.5, to the list of branches in the playbook. He reran the Antora command, and Antora automatically detected that many pages now existed in both the 6.0 and 5.5 versions. The UI instantly updated to include a version drop-down selector on those pages, letting users switch seamlessly between the documentation for each version.
So the site itself becomes version aware.
Exactly. It knows which pages are available in which versions and helps the user navigate that.
What about editing content locally?
He showed that too.
Yeah.
He cloned one of the Couchbase content repos to his local machine, opened in a SciDoc file, introduction.adoc, I think, made a tiny change, just added hide FX or something simple.
Okay.
Then he edited his local playbook file slightly, changing the URL for that one repository to point to his local file path instead of the remote GitHub URL. Reran Antora, and his hide FX change immediately appeared in the locally generated site.
So it's easy to preview changes locally before pushing them.
Very easy. Really nice workflow for writers.
And navigation. How are links between pages handled?
That was interesting too. The navigation menu on the left, that's also defined in a SciDoc file. And he showed the linking syntax using xref. This lets you create links between pages, even across different components and versions.
Axref. So it's smarter than a simple HTML link.
Much smarter. You can link to a page in a specific version, or importantly, you can link to the latest version of a page, and Antora figures out which version that is based on your configuration. Keeps links from breaking or pointing to old info.
That latest link sounds really useful. And the UI customization.
Oh yeah, that was a cool moment. He went back to the playbook, changed one line, the UI bundle URL, to point to a completely, and the entire look and feel of the Couchbase doc site radically changed. Different colors, different layout, different fonts, but the content underneath was exactly the same.
Wow. That really drives home the separation of content and presentation.
It absolutely does. Powerful stuff.
Did you touch on search? That's pretty critical for docs.
Briefly, he mentioned that Antora itself doesn't bundle a search engine, adhering to the decoupled philosophy. But he highlighted tools like Algolia Doc Search, which is what Couchbase uses. He showed their live site search with its autocomplete, making the point that you integrate best-of-breed search solutions with the static site Antora generates.
Okay, so bringing this all together, drawing perhaps from other experts like Alexander Schwartz too, what are the big picture benefits here?
Well, Schwartz really emphasizes user empowerment. With Antora, users get documentation that's reliably up to date and actually matches the software version they're using. That builds a lot of trust.
Reduces that frustration factor we mentioned earlier.
Hugely. And the automation via CI/CD is transformative. Documentation delivery becomes part of your software delivery pipeline, keeping everything in sync. Less chance of dogs lagging behind code.
Schwartz also mentioned discoverability, right? The structure helps users find things.
Yes. Antora sites are inherently topic-based. You get good navigation structures, those powerful cross-references we talked about. Plus, grouping content by component and version lets users filter down to exactly what's relevant for them.
Makes sense. What about the technical side? Performance, dependencies?
It's built on Node.js, known for being pretty fast. It aims for minimal dependencies, and the architecture is modular and extensible so you can adapt it. And fundamentally, writing in a Shane doc is just a good experience for technical content, plain text, Git friendly, but really feature rich for complex docs, supported by the solid Asset Doctor toolchain.
And the writer developer experience seems enhanced too, with things like IDE plugins.
Definitely. Schwartz himself maintains the IntelliJ SciDoc plugin, which gives you live previews, auto completion for things like those href links, navigation help. It makes writing much smoother.
So that docs as code mantra really pays off.
It seems so. Keeping docs close to code means commit histories can link doc changes to related code changes. It encourages collaboration between devs and writers. And as Alan noted, it scales works for small projects, works for huge enterprise documentation portals like Couchbases.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, it really feels like Antora offers a very focused, very specialized approach for the complexities of software documentation.
It does. By really leaning into that docs as code philosophy, it streamlines how teams create, manage versions, and publish docs, especially when the source material is scattered.
And the end result, hopefully, is a much better experience for the software's users.
Absolutely. Accurate, timely, well-organized documentation. It just makes software easier to use and reduces friction. It enhances the perception of quality across the board.
So for you, our listener, maybe the key takeaway is to really think about documentation not as some separate burdensome task, but as a core part of the software lifecycle itself.
Right. And to recognize the potential of using a dedicated platform like Antora, aligning your documentation processes much more closely with how you already build and deliver your software.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to consider. How could making a strategic shift, investing in better documentation tooling and processes, actually change how your users perceive and interact with your software?
Could that focus on documentation become a genuine competitive advantage, helping your users succeed and ultimately making your product stand out? It's worth thinking about exploring Antora further, seeing how its approach might map to the specific challenges your own team faces with documentation today.